Opening. November 1892, Appalachian Mountains. The fog rolled down from the mountains like something alive, thick, cold, and suffocating. It crept through the valleys of the Appalachian wilderness, swallowing pine trees and dirt roads, turning the world into a colorless void. November in these mountains was unforgiving. The air carried the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, mixed with wood smoke from scattered cabins that dotted the hillsides like forgotten prayers. In 1892, this region was a world apart from the growing cities of the East Coast. Here, time moved differently. News traveled slowly, arriving weeks late through traveling merchants or the occasional postal rider who braved the treacherous mountain passes. The people who lived here were hardened by isolation, men and women who knew the weight of an axe, the bite of winter frost, and the particular silence that settles over these ancient hills when something isn't right. The nearest town, Hollow Creek, was barely a collection of weathered buildings, a general store, a church with peeling white paint, a blacksmith's forge, and perhaps 24 homes scattered along a muddy main street. Beyond that, families lived miles apart, their cabins tucked into clearings carved from the endless forest. They were self-sufficient by necessity, suspicious by nature, and bound by unspoken rules that governed mountain life. It was a place where people disappeared. Sometimes they wandered too far into the woods and were never seen again. Sometimes they fled debts or feuds, leaving in the dead of night. And sometimes, though no one spoke of it openly, the mountains themselves seemed to claim them. The Warren family had settled in these mountains 3 years prior, in the spring of 1889. They came from somewhere east. Virginia, some said, though others whispered it was further, that they were running from something. But in the Appalachians, questions about a person's past were considered impolite at best, dangerous at worst. Samuel Warren was the father, 42 years old, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of hard labor and harder winters. He stood just over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that bore the calluses of a man who worked with wood and stone. His beard, once dark brown, had begun to show streaks of gray that made him look older than his years. He had a particular habit of stroking that beard when he was thinking, his pale blue eyes going distant, as if he could see through the present moment into something beyond. Samuel rarely smiled, but when he did, it transformed his entire face. His daughter claimed she could count on one hand the number of times she'd heard him truly laugh. He was a carpenter by trade, skilled enough that people from neighboring valleys would commission work from him, cabinets, door frames, coffins. Always coffins. In the mountains, death was a steady business. Margaret Warren, his wife, was 38, with the kind of severe beauty that photographs of that era often captured. High cheekbones, dark hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her skin, and eyes the color of storm clouds. She was thin, almost fragile in appearance, but those who knew her understood that she possessed the quiet strength that kept families alive through brutal winters. Her hands were always in motion, kneading bread, mending clothes, stirring pots over the fire. She hummed while she worked, old hymns mostly, though sometimes melodies no one recognized. But Margaret had a peculiar habit that the neighbors found unsettling. She collected things, small objects she found in the forest during her walks. Smooth stones, bird bones bleached white by the sun, twisted roots that resembled human forms. She arranged them on the windowsill of their cabin, creating patterns that seemed deliberate, but whose meaning remained opaque. When asked about it, she would only smile and say, "The mountain provides." Their children completed the family portrait. Eliza, 16 years old, with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes, a striking combination that had already attracted the attention of young men from surrounding farms. She kept a journal, its leather cover worn smooth by her constant handling. In it, she wrote poetry, sketches of the forest, and observations about the world around her. She had a habit of biting her lower lip when concentrating, leaving it perpetually raw and reddened. Then there was Thomas, 11, wild as the mountain itself. He had sandy brown hair that never stayed combed, freckles scattered across his nose, and a gap between his front teeth that appeared when he grinned, which was often. Thomas collected things too, but unlike his mother's mysterious arrangements, his treasures were the simple fascinations of boyhood: interesting rocks, shed snakeskins, the skull of a fox he'd found near the creek. He had a wooden whistle that his father had carved for him, and he would practice bird calls for hours, driving his sister to distraction. The Warrens lived in a cabin they'd built themselves, about 6 miles from Hollow Creek, accessible only by a narrow path that wound through dense forest. It was a solid structure. Samuel knew his craft, with a stone chimney, 2 rooms, and a loft where the children slept. Behind the cabin stood a small barn for their 2 horses, a handful of chickens, and a milk cow. By all accounts, they were an unremarkable family. Hard-working, quiet. Perhaps a bit odd, as Margaret's collection suggested. But in the mountains, everyone had their peculiarities. They attended church in Hollow Creek sporadically. The journey was difficult, especially in winter. But when they did appear, they sat in the back pew, said their prayers, and left without much socializing. The first indication that something was wrong came not from the Warrens themselves, but from Josiah Fletcher, a trapper who worked the valleys north of their property. Josiah was a solitary man, 63 years old, with a face like cracked leather and eyes that had witnessed things he never spoke about. He knew every trail, every game path, every hidden hollow in these mountains. On October 28th, as the sun began its descent behind the ridgeline, Josiah was checking his trap lines near Cedar Hollow, about 2 miles from the Warren cabin. The forest was entering its death phase, leaves carpeting the ground in shades of rust and gold, the air sharp with the promise of winter. He moved quietly, as was his nature, listening to the sounds of the woods settling into dusk. That's when he heard it, or rather, didn't hear it. Silence. Not the natural quiet of a forest at rest, but an absence, a void where sound should exist. No birds calling their evening songs, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. No wind moving through the branches, just nothing. Josiah stood perfectly still, his weathered hand gripping the rifle slung across his shoulder. In 63 years of living in these mountains, he'd learned that such silence meant only one thing. Something was wrong. Animals knew danger before humans did. They felt it in ways that civilized folk had forgotten. He moved cautiously toward the Warren property, though he couldn't have explained why. The feeling of wrongness grew stronger with each step, settling in his chest like a stone. When he finally reached the clearing where the Warren cabin stood, the sun had dipped below the mountains, leaving everything bathed in that peculiar blue light that comes just before true darkness. The cabin looked normal, almost too normal. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin, steady stream that suggested a fire burning low. The barn doors were closed. The chickens were quiet in their coop. Nothing appeared disturbed, but the silence persisted. Josiah called out, "Samuel, Margaret, anyone home?" His voice seemed to die in the air, absorbed by something he couldn't see. No response came from the cabin. No dog barked, though he suddenly realized he hadn't seen their dog, a mixed breed named Rufus, who usually announced visitors long before they reached the property. He approached the door, knocked 3 times. The sound was hollow, final. Nothing. Years of mountain wisdom told him to leave, to turn around and head back to his own cabin before full darkness fell. But something else, curiosity, concern, or perhaps the same compulsion that draws moths to flame, made him try the door handle. It was unlocked. The door swung open with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. Inside, the fire burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The table was set for dinner. 4 plates, 4 cups, utensils neatly arranged. A pot of stew hung over the fire, its contents long since dried and burned to the bottom. The smell of scorched food filled the room. But there was something else, something that made Josiah's skin crawl. On the table, in the center, sat Margaret's collection of objects from the windowsill, but they had been rearranged. Instead of their usual scattered pattern, they now formed a perfect circle. In the center of that circle lay Eliza's journal, open to a page covered in frantic handwriting, so different from her usual careful script that it looked like it had been written by another person entirely. Josiah couldn't read well, but he could make out enough. The words seemed to repeat. They're here, in the walls, behind the trees, watching, always watching. Mother says we mustn't look. Father has seen them. Thomas heard them calling his name. The rest dissolved into illegible scrawls and what might have been drawings, crude, disturbing shapes that hurt to look at. Josiah backed out of the cabin, his heart hammering. He looked around the clearing once more. The barn. He should check the barn. But as he turned toward it, movement caught his eye. Not from the barn, but from the tree line. For just a moment, less than a heartbeat, he could have sworn he saw figures standing among the pines. 4 of them, perfectly still, watching. He blinked, and they were gone. Just shadows, just tricks of the dying light. Josiah Fletcher was not a man who frightened easily, but he ran that night. Ran like he hadn't in 40 years, stumbling down the dark path toward Hollow Creek, the silence of the Warren homestead chasing him like a living thing. By the next morning, when Josiah brought Sheriff Cole Mercer and 3 other men to the Warren cabin, they found exactly what he had described: the burned stew, the set table, the strange arrangement of objects, the journal with its maddening scrawls. But they also found more. In the barn, the animals were gone, not dead, not escaped, simply absent, as if they had never existed. The stalls were clean, the feeding troughs empty and dry. In the children's loft, Thomas's wooden whistle lay on his bedroll. When Sheriff Mercer picked it up and blew into it, no sound came out, though there was no obvious blockage. Samuel's tools were neatly arranged in his workshop, a half-finished cabinet sitting on his workbench, but his good coat was missing from the peg by the door. So were Margaret's heavy shawl and the children's winter boots. It appeared in every practical sense that the Warren family had simply walked away from their lives, prepared for travel perhaps, but leaving everything else behind: food cooking, fire burning, possessions untouched. The men searched the surrounding forest for 3 days. They found no tracks, no signs of struggle, no indication of which direction the family might have gone. It was as if they had been lifted straight up into the sky, or had stepped through some invisible door into a world that existed alongside this one. The only thing they found, and this detail would haunt the investigation for years to come, was a photograph. It was nailed to a tree about 100 yards from the cabin at eye level. The nail had been driven through the top center, causing the photograph to hang slightly askew. It was a formal portrait, the kind taken in photography studios that were beginning to appear in larger towns. It showed the Warren family, Samuel and Margaret standing behind their seated children, all dressed in their Sunday best, staring solemnly at the camera as was the custom of the era. But someone had defaced it. Using what appeared to be charcoal or soot, rough X marks had been drawn over each face, obscuring their features. And written across the bottom, in the same frantic handwriting from Eliza's journal, were 4 words: "We saw them too." Sheriff Mercer took the photograph, placed it in an evidence envelope, and filed it away in the small office he maintained in Hollow Creek. He launched what passed for an official investigation in these parts, questioned neighbors, sent inquiries to surrounding counties, contacted what few family members the Warrens had mentioned. Nothing came of it. The Warren family had vanished as completely as morning mist under the mountain sun. Eventually, as winter descended with its brutal cold, the searches stopped. The cabin sat empty, the door locked by the sheriff. The forest reclaimed the paths. And the people of Hollow Creek, in the way of mountain folk, simply stopped speaking about it. The Warren family became a whisper, a cautionary tale told in fragments, a mystery that settled into the bones of the land like so many others before it. But the story didn't end there. Because 37 years later, in the summer of 1929, a group of surveyors mapping the mountains for the National Forest Service would find something hidden in a collapsed mine shaft, 12 miles from where the Warren cabin once stood. A leather satchel, remarkably preserved by the dry conditions inside the mine. And inside that satchel, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture, were photographs. Dozens of photographs. Photographs that should never have existed. Photographs that raised more questions than they could ever answer. Photographs that suggested the Warren family's disappearance was not the end of their story, but merely the beginning of something far more terrible. But that discovery, and the horrors it would reveal, lay decades in the future. For now, in the winter of 1892, the mountains kept their secrets. The wind howled through the empty Warren cabin, snow piled against the door, and in the darkness of the Appalachian night, if you listened carefully, you might hear it. The faint sound of a wooden whistle, playing a tune no bird had ever sung. End of Chapter 1. The summer of 1929 arrived in the Appalachian Mountains with oppressive humidity that clung to everything like wet wool. The world had changed dramatically since the Warren family vanished. The Great War had come and gone, automobiles rattled along improved roads, and even these remote mountains had begun to feel the creeping fingers of modernity. The National Forest Service had dispatched a team of surveyors to map the region for potential conservation. Among them was James Holloway, a 28-year-old engineer from Pittsburgh with wire-rimmed glasses and soft hands that had never known real labor. He approached the mountains with the confidence of educated youth, armed with theodolites, measuring chains, and the certainty that the wilderness could be cataloged and understood. With him were Ray Duncan and Albert Cross, local men hired as guides, men whose families had lived in these hills for generations. They knew the stories. They remembered the whispers about the Warren family, though both had been children when it happened. Ray, now 47, with a limp from a logging accident, had even attended school briefly with Eliza Warren in Hollow Creek's one-room schoolhouse. On July 16, 1929, the surveying team was working near an area marked on old maps as Cedar Hollow, though no one living could remember why it bore that name. The cedars, if they had ever existed, were long gone, replaced by dense stands of pine and oak. Albert was the one who found the mine entrance. It was barely visible, hidden behind a collapse of rocks and decades of vine growth. The wooden support beams, what remained of them, were blackened with age and rot. The opening was perhaps 4 feet high, a dark mouth in the hillside that seemed to exhale cool, stale air. Probably an old coal test shaft, James said, consulting his maps. They tried mining all through here in the 1870s. Most of it was abandoned when the veins played out. Ray crouched near the entrance, his weathered face troubled. "Feels wrong," he muttered. "Air coming out of there. It's cold. Middle of summer, and it's cold as January." James, with the dismissiveness of the educated toward superstition, ignored him. "We need to document it. Map the entrance. Check the stability." He pulled out his camera, a Kodak Vest Pocket, one of the newer models that had become popular after the war. They spent an hour clearing enough debris to safely enter. The shaft descended at a gentle angle, the ceiling low enough that they had to crouch. James went first with a lantern, followed by Albert, while Ray remained outside, his unease growing with each passing minute. The shaft extended perhaps 50 yards before ending in a small chamber, likely where the miners had given up, finding the coal quality poor, or the vein too thin to pursue. The walls were rough-hewn, showing the marks of picks and hand drills. Water had seeped through cracks over the years, leaving mineral deposits that gleamed in the lantern light like frozen tears. It was Albert who saw it, a shape in the corner that didn't match the rough stone. "Jim, bring that light over here." Wedged into a crevice, deliberately hidden, was a leather satchel. It was old, the leather darkened and stiff, but remarkably intact. The dry conditions inside the mine had preserved it far better than if it had been left exposed to the elements. James lifted it carefully. It was heavier than expected. He undid the brass buckles, still functional after all these years, and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were photographs. Dozens of them. Perhaps 70 or 80 in total, along with a small notebook, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. "Jesus Christ," Albert whispered, holding the lantern closer. The photographs were formal portraits mostly, the kind taken in studios with painted backdrops and careful posing. But as James flipped through them, a pattern emerged that made his skin crawl despite his rational mind. Every photograph showed the same four people: a tall, bearded man, a severe-looking woman, a teenage girl, and a young boy. The Warren family, though James didn't know that yet. But what made the photographs disturbing was that they had been taken over time. Years, perhaps. In some, the children were clearly younger. In others, they had aged. The boy's face grew longer, less childlike. The girl developed into a young woman. But there was something wrong with all of them. In every single photograph, the family members' eyes had been carefully scratched out. Not violently, but methodically, as if done with a pin or needle, creating tiny holes where their pupils should have been. The effect was deeply unsettling. Blank, staring faces with voids for eyes. More disturbing still were the backgrounds. James was familiar with photography studios and their painted backdrops, pastoral scenes, formal libraries, classical columns. But these backgrounds were different. They shifted. In one photo, the family stood before what appeared to be a forest scene, but the trees seemed wrong, their proportions distorted, their shadows falling in impossible directions. In another, the backdrop appeared to show the interior of a cabin, but the perspective was skewed, the walls seeming to curve inward as if the room itself were alive and breathing. "Look at this one," Albert said, his voice barely above a whisper. He held up a photograph that showed the family outdoors. A genuine outdoor photograph, not a studio portrait. They stood in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. Behind them, just visible among the trees, were shapes. Human-shaped, but not quite. Tall and impossibly thin, their proportions wrong in ways that made the eye slide away from examining them too closely. James took the photograph with trembling hands. As a man of science, he wanted to dismiss it as a trick of light, a double exposure, a flaw in the development process. But he couldn't. The figures were too deliberate, too carefully positioned. And the Warren family, he could see their faces clearly in this one, before someone had scratched out their eyes, wore expressions of absolute terror. The notebook provided context, though it raised more questions than it answered. The handwriting matched what was in Eliza's journal, that same progression from careful script to frantic scrawling. The entries were dated, beginning in September 1892 and ending on November 1st of that same year. James sat in the mine shaft, reading by lantern light while Albert looked over his shoulder. Ray had been called down, his reluctance overcome by curiosity. The notebook told a story that defied belief. September 15th, 1892. Mother's collections have changed. She no longer gathers them from her walks. She says they appear in the cabin while we sleep. Father found one on his pillow this morning, a perfect circle of small bones. He was angry, thought Thomas was playing tricks. But Thomas swears it wasn't him, and I believe him. There's something in his eyes lately, fear that a boy shouldn't know. September 23rd, 1892. The photographs began arriving today. The first one was nailed to the barn door. It shows our family, but I don't remember posing for it. Mother says we must have forgotten that we visited a photographer in the spring, but I keep our family accounts. There's no record of such an expense. And my dress in the photograph. I've never owned a dress like that. October 2nd, 1892. 3 more photographs today. One in Father's toolbox, one in the chicken coop, one floating in the water barrel. Father tried to burn them, but they wouldn't catch fire. They're wet now, soaked from the barrel, but the images are still clear. How is that possible? Water should have ruined them. October 8th, 1892. Thomas saw them last night. He woke screaming, saying there were people standing around his bed, watching him sleep. Tall people. Wrong people. Mother tried to comfort him, but her hands were shaking. She sees them too. I know she does. She's been arranging her objects in patterns, circles within circles, like she's trying to build some kind of protection. October 15th, 1892. We went to town today, trying to escape, but the photographer's studio, the one where we supposedly had our portrait taken, burned down 3 years ago. The proprietor died in the fire. So who took our photographs? Who keeps taking them? Because there was another one this morning, showing us from yesterday, standing in front of the photographer's burned ruins. We were being watched even then. October 20th, 1892. Father admitted what he's been hiding. 3 weeks ago, he found something in the woods while working on the Thorntons' barn. A clearing he'd never seen before, though he's walked those woods for years. In the center was a camera on a tripod pointing at nothing. Just standing there. Abandoned, he thought. He approached it, and that's when he heard the shutter click. The camera took his photograph, by itself. He ran, but when he looked back, figures were emerging from the trees. The tall ones, the wrong ones. They were gathering around the camera like worshippers at an altar. October 27th, 1892. We found the mine shaft today. Father thinks we can hide there, that the earth will protect us. He's moving supplies, preparing for us to leave the cabin. Mother is gathering all the photographs, every single one that's appeared. She says we need to keep them, that destroying them would be worse. I don't understand her logic, but I'm too frightened to argue. Thomas hasn't spoken in 2 days. He just clutches his whistle and stares at the walls. November 1st, 1892. This will be my final entry. Tomorrow we go to the mine. Father says there's a chamber deep inside, a place they'll never find us. But Mother knows the truth. I can see it in her eyes. There is no hiding from them. They're not from our world, not bound by our rules. The photographs prove it. Each one shows us somewhere we've been, doing things we've done, but taken from angles that shouldn't exist. Taken from places where no human could stand. They've been watching us since we arrived in these mountains, maybe before, maybe our whole lives. The last photograph arrived an hour ago. It shows the 4 of us inside the mine, but we haven't gone there yet. This photograph shows our future. We're sitting in a circle in that deep chamber, and our faces, God help us, our faces show that we finally understand. We've seen what they are, what they want. If someone finds this, know that we chose to go. Not from bravery, but because the alternative, staying and letting them take us slowly, photograph by photograph, moment by moment, was worse. At least in the mine, in the darkness, there might be an end. Tell our families we're sorry. Tell them we love them, and tell them to burn these photographs. All of them. Even if they won't catch fire, keep trying. The entry ended there, the final words trailing off the page. James sat in silence, the notebook trembling in his hands. Albert had gone pale, his lantern shaking so badly that shadows danced across the walls like living things. Ray stood at the tunnel entrance, as if ready to bolt at any moment. The chamber, James finally said. She mentioned a chamber deep inside. But this shaft only goes 50 yards. It ends right here. Ray shook his head slowly. Maybe when they were here, it went deeper. Could have collapsed since then. But even as he said it, Albert was examining the back wall more carefully. He ran his hands over the rock, searching. Then he stopped, his fingers finding something. Here. The stone's different here. Looser. They worked for 20 minutes, carefully removing stones that had been deliberately stacked. Not a natural collapse, but a wall. Someone had sealed off the deeper section of the mine. As they removed the final stones, The lantern light revealed a continuation of the tunnel, descending further into darkness. "We should go back," Ray said. "Get more men. Better equipment." But James was already moving forward, compelled by something stronger than caution. The tunnel descended for another 30 yards before opening into a larger chamber, perhaps 15 feet across. And there, in the center, they found them. 4 skeletons, sitting in a perfect circle, facing inward. 3 adults and 1 child, their bones yellowed with age but still articulated, held in place by the dry air and stillness of the tomb. They wore the remnants of clothing, rotted fabric that might once have been a coat, a shawl, a dress, a boy's shirt. In the center of their circle lay the camera. An old bellows camera, its wooden body remarkably preserved, brass fittings still gleaming in the lantern light. It sat on a small tripod, pointing at nothing, or perhaps at everything, its lens like a dead eye watching the dead. Around the skeletons, arranged in careful patterns, were objects, stones, bones, roots, Margaret's collections. They formed concentric circles, spreading outward from the camera like ripples in a pond. And there were more photographs, scattered among the bones and stones, their surfaces reflecting the lantern light. James approached slowly, as if walking through a nightmare. He picked up one of the photographs with shaking hands. It showed the chamber exactly as it was now. 4 skeletons in a circle, the camera in the center, the patterns spreading outward. And in the background, barely visible in the darkness beyond the lantern light, stood 3 figures. James, Albert, and Ray, seen from an impossible angle, taken by a camera that no one was operating. He dropped the photograph, and it fluttered to the ground, landing face up among the others. Each one he could see showed the same thing, this moment, this discovery, captured from every conceivable angle. The future photographed by the past, the watchers documenting their own discovery. "We need to leave," Albert whispered, his voice breaking. "We need to leave, right now." But Ray wasn't moving. He was staring at something in the corner, his face drained of all color. Following his gaze, James saw it, a fresh photograph, the chemicals still glistening as if it had just been developed. It showed the 3 of them standing in the mine, looking at the very photograph they were now looking at. An infinite loop of observation. And behind them in the image, emerging from the darkness, were the tall figures. The wrong ones. The watchers who had followed the Warren family into the earth. They ran. Through the tunnel, through the shaft, into the blinding sunlight of the summer day. They didn't stop until they reached their camp, where they gathered their equipment with trembling hands and fled the mountains entirely. James Holloway reported the discovery to the authorities, but when a team was sent to investigate 3 days later, they found nothing. The mine entrance had collapsed completely, not recently, but as if it had been that way for decades. No amount of digging revealed the shaft, the chamber, or the remains of the Warren family. The photographs from the leather satchel were confiscated by the Forest Service and locked away in an archive in Washington, D.C., classified under geological anomalies. The notebook disappeared entirely, though James kept his personal notes, detailed descriptions of what they had found, what they had read, what they had seen. He never returned to the Appalachian Mountains. Neither did Albert or Ray. But for the rest of their lives, they would occasionally receive photographs in the mail, no return address, no postmark, just photographs showing them going about their daily lives, captured from angles that shouldn't exist, taken by cameras that no one was operating. To understand what happened to the Warren family, one must first accept that the Appalachian Mountains are older than human comprehension. Long before the first settlers carved their cabins from the wilderness, before native peoples walked these trails, before the continents themselves took their current form, these mountains stood. And in their ancient hollows, in the spaces between stone and root, things exist that predate our understanding of reality. The Warren family's mistake was simple. They saw something they shouldn't have seen. It happened in the spring of 1889, shortly after they arrived in the mountains. Samuel Warren, while scouting timber for their future cabin, stumbled upon a clearing that existed in a fold of reality, a place where the membrane between worlds had grown thin. In that clearing stood markers, arrangements of stone and bone that had been maintained for centuries by those who knew the old ways, warning markers that said, "Do not enter, do not observe, do not acknowledge what you see here." But Samuel didn't know to look for such warnings. He entered the clearing with the confidence of a man who believed the world could be understood and conquered. And there, in the center, he saw them. The Watchers, the thin folk, the ones who exist in the spaces between photographs, between moments, between heartbeats. They are not malevolent in the way humans understand malice. They simply are, existing in a state of perpetual observation, recording reality through means that bypass time and space as we know them. When Samuel saw them, they saw him. And in that mutual observation, a connection was formed that could never be broken. The photographs that plagued the Warren family were not taken by any human hand, nor by any human device. They were manifestations of the Watcher's attention, each image a record of observation, a proof that the family had been seen in a way that transcended normal perception. Margaret Warren, with her mountain-bred intuition, understood this before the others. Her collections, her careful arrangements of found objects, were attempts at a counter-magic, using the old ways to create barriers against the attention that had fixed itself upon them. But she was working with fragments of knowledge, half-remembered folklore, rituals whose true meanings had been lost generations ago. The patterns she created did work, briefly. They obscured the family from the Watcher's direct attention, created moments of shadow where observation couldn't penetrate. But it was like trying to hide from the sun by closing your eyes, a temporary illusion of safety that changed nothing about the fundamental reality of being seen. Eliza, with her poet's sensitivity and her habit of recording the world around her, became a conduit. Her journal entries from those final weeks show a mind expanding beyond normal perception, beginning to see the world as the Watchers saw it, not as a linear progression of moments, but as a simultaneous existence of all times and places. This is why her handwriting deteriorated. She was trying to record experiences that human language and linear thought couldn't properly contain. Thomas, the youngest, heard them. The Watchers communicate not through sound, as we understand it, but through a resonance that some describe as music, others as voices, still others as a humming that seems to come from inside one's own skull. His wooden whistle, that simple carved toy, became an antenna for this resonance, which is why it produced no sound when Sheriff Mercer tried to play it. It was no longer functioning in the acoustic realm humans inhabit. The family's choice to hide in the mine shaft was both logical and tragic. In folklore across cultures, the earth has always been considered a place of protection. Demons and spirits supposedly cannot follow into the deep ground, their powers bound to the surface world. But the Watchers are not spirits in any traditional sense. They exist outside the frameworks of human mythology, operating on principles that predate such categorizations. The earth offered no sanctuary from them, because they don't inhabit space in the way physical beings do. What the mine shaft did offer was isolation, a place where the family could, theoretically, wait out the Watcher's attention, hoping it would eventually turn elsewhere. They brought supplies for weeks, perhaps months. They sealed themselves in, blocking the tunnel behind them to prevent anyone from following, or perhaps to prevent themselves from losing resolve and fleeing back to the surface. The camera they brought with them, the same camera Samuel had found in that original clearing, was their greatest mistake and their final act of defiance. Margaret believed that if they used the Watcher's own mechanism of observation against them, if they documented themselves in their final refuge, they might create a paradox that would break the connection. She was partially correct. The photographs they took of themselves in that chamber, using the Watcher's camera, did create a strange loop of observation. The family photographing themselves while being photographed by the Watchers, creating images that existed in multiple states simultaneously, both as human artifacts and as manifestations of otherworldly attention. No one can say exactly how long the Warren family survived in that sealed chamber. Days, perhaps, maybe weeks. The mine's dry air would have preserved them, prevented decay, allowed them to mummify naturally into the skeletal circle that James Holloway would discover decades later. The evidence suggests they didn't die from starvation or thirst or madness, though all three were surely present. They died from seeing. In that chamber, with the camera as a focal point, they finally perceived the watchers completely, not as glimpses in the forest or shadows at the edge of vision, but in their totality. Human consciousness isn't built to accommodate such perception. It's like trying to pour the ocean into a teacup. The mind breaks, not from terror or incomprehension, but from simple overload. The neural pathways that define individual identity, that separate self from environment, dissolve. What remains is something that has seen too much to continue existing as human. The circle they formed in death was deliberate, a final ritual taught to Margaret by the mountain folk, meant for those who had gone too far beyond the veil to return. Sit facing inward, see each other one final time as human beings, and let the observation of loved ones be the last thing that registers before the self disperses entirely. The discovery in 1929 was not coincidental. The watchers arranged it, just as they arrange everything they observe. They wanted their documentation found, wanted the photographs seen by new eyes, wanted the cycle to continue. James Holloway, Albert Cross, and Ray Duncan became the next subjects, though their exposure was limited enough that they remained functional humans. The photographs they received throughout their lives were reminders, tokens of sustained attention, but not the all-consuming focus that had destroyed the Warrens. Why do the watchers observe? Why do they document? These questions assume motive, assume consciousness, in a form we can comprehend. It's more accurate to say that observation is what they are, just as a river flows without deciding to flow. They are the universe watching itself, recording itself, creating permanent records of temporary moments. The Appalachian Mountains remain their primary domain because the mountains are old enough, isolated enough, that thin places still exist, clearings where the membrane between worlds grows permeable. Modern development has sealed many of these places, covered them with roads and towns and the electromagnetic noise of contemporary life. But some remain, hidden in the deepest hollows, waiting for someone to stumble into them as Samuel Warren did. The photographs confiscated in 1929 remain in government archives, though their exact location has been classified and reclassified so many times that no single agency can say definitively where they are. Some claim they were destroyed in a fire in 1942. Others insist they were transferred to a facility specializing in anomalous objects. A few conspiracy theorists believe they're stored beneath the Smithsonian, in vaults that house the nation's unexplainable artifacts. The truth is that it doesn't matter where the physical photographs are. They exist now in a state beyond physicality, as ideas, as warnings, as seeds planted in the minds of anyone who learns the Warren family's story. Each retelling is a form of observation, a way of keeping the family's final moments alive in collective memory. And the watchers appreciate this. They thrive on attention, on observation, on the act of seeing and being seen. Every time someone tells the story of the Warren family, every time someone searches for information about their disappearance, every time someone looks at a photograph and wonders about the angle from which it was taken, the watcher's work continues. The cabin where the Warrens lived is long gone, reclaimed entirely by the forest. The mineshaft has never been relocated, despite multiple expeditions by those who know James Holloway's story. Hollow Creek itself is barely a ghost town now, a few foundations and a crumbling church the only evidence it ever existed. But on certain nights, when the fog rolls down from the mountains and the air carries that particular stillness that precedes something wrong, hikers in the Appalachian wilderness report strange phenomena. The sound of a wooden whistle playing melodies no bird could make. The glimpse of 4 figures standing in a circle, visible for just a moment before vanishing. and most commonly, the feeling of being watched, not by human eyes, but by something that sees more deeply, more completely than any human ever could. They find photographs sometimes, nailed to trees or tucked into rock crevices. Hikers discover them and pocket them, curious, amused, sometimes unsettled. The photos show the finders themselves, captured moments before from impossible angles. Most people dismiss them as elaborate pranks, the work of hidden cameras and mischievous locals. But some understand. Some see their own eyes in the photographs, not scratched out, not yet, and recognize the beginning of something that cannot be stopped. They become aware of attention focusing upon them, of being documented by forces that exist outside normal space and time. These people have a choice: ignore the signs and continue their lives, hoping the attention will fade. Or do what the Warren family did: seek the deep places, the sealed chambers, the spaces beneath the earth where they might hide from observation. Neither choice offers salvation. There is no escaping what has already seen you. There is no hiding from what exists in all places simultaneously. There is only the slow accumulation of photographs, the gradual dissolution of the self under sustained observation, the final understanding that to be completely seen is to be completely known, and to be completely known is to cease existing as a separate individual thing. In a filing cabinet in an undisclosed location, there is one photograph that was never officially catalogued. It was found in James Holloway's belongings after his death in 1967, sealed in an envelope marked, "Do not open, destroy unviewed." His children, of course, opened it. The photograph shows a cave chamber, lit by an impossible light that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. In the center, 4 skeletons sit in a circle around an antique camera. Around them, arranged in complex patterns, are stones and bones and twisted roots. But this photograph is different from all the others. In the background, barely visible, are not 3 figures but thousands. An army of watchers stretching back into infinity, each one observing, each one documenting, each one existing in that liminal space between presence and absence. And at the very center of the image, if you look closely, though it's not recommended that you do, you can see the reflection in the camera's lens. It shows not the chamber, but a forest clearing in springtime. A man stands at the edge, about to step forward, about to see something he shouldn't see, about to forge a connection that will span generations and destroy everything he loves. The photograph shows the beginning and the end simultaneously, the way the watchers see all things, as a single, eternal moment of observation. This is what happened to the Warren family. This is what waits in the Appalachian Mountains. This is the price of being seen by what should not see. And somewhere, right now, a camera is documenting you reading these words, from an angle that shouldn't exist, creating a photograph that will find its way to you someday, showing you this very moment from the outside, proving that you too have been observed. The watchers are patient. They have all the time that exists and all the time that doesn't. They are already documenting your future, filing away photographs of moments you haven't experienced yet. The only question is, will you see them before they show you what you've become? The end.